he has Socrates, who's the principal speaker in the Republic, say at one point, the way to learn about tyranny is to listen to a man who's lived under the roof of a tyrant. That seems to be an unmistakable reference to Plato's own experience. So the Republic presents a very harsh attack on tyranny and what Plato calls the tyrannical man, the man who wants to be a tyrant, and instead exalts this figure of the philosopher king, the person we call the philosopher king.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. Plato and the Tyrant, a new book from James Romm, Professor James Romm, at Bard College. The fall of Greece's greatest dynasty and the making of a philosophic masterpiece, that would be the Republic. I had read the Republic as a student and assumed that it came out of the imagination of one man named Plato. Turns out there's reason to believe it was based upon visits to Sicily, Syracuse, Sicily especially. The last time I was in Syracuse, I was with the British Army clawing its way up the coastline under the guidance and the leadership of the British Army, while Patton made an end run north of the island and then came in from the west. That was the last time I was in Sicily, and it was desperate. The Germans had chopped up the whole island, and it was dry and abandoned, and the people were very poor and were starving. However, now we return to a Sicily in the 4th century BCE that is filled with philosophy and tyranny. Professor, a very good day to you. Forgive my departure, because in reading the story of Sicily in the 4th century BCE, I couldn't help but think about the armies in the 20th century AD, and I wondered if those armies, they were all very educated men, especially the British. I wonder if they reflected upon the matters that you address. We begin with Syracuse itself. It is a city founded by Corinth at war with Carthage, if I remember correctly. Why did it become so prominent and so powerful in the 4th century BCE? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John, and thank you for your interest in the book. So in the 4th century BCE, we have to bear in mind that Athens and Sparta had pretty well knocked each other down to second-rate status. They had fought a terrible war, the Peloponnesian War, that had ended in 404, and both were greatly diminished by that conflict, as well as other cities in mainland Greece. The Greek West, as I call it, the cities of Sicily and southern Italy, had not really been involved in that contest. Well, Syracuse was a target for a while, but had managed to recover itself. And under the tyranny of Dionysius I, who came to power right about 404, the time of the end of the Peloponnesian War, built itself into an immensely powerful and prosperous state.
Yes, that state was based on geography and ambition. Let's talk of the geography first, because you mentioned Dionysius the Elder. He was a clerk, and he became a king, and then he became a tyrant. How did he do it?
So he never quite became a king, although the Greeks of other cities might have considered him that. He called himself Archon, which is a kind of a neutral title, leader, more or less, in Greek, that suggested he was a legitimate ruler. In fact, he came to power as a demagogue, railing against the perfidy of the rich and the betrayal of Syracuse by elite leaders, generals, who were collaborating with the Carthaginians, the great enemy of Syracuse, and conspiring to enrich themselves and do their own country in. And the populace, the masses, were very sympathetic to that argument, and they immediately appointed him as their general, their leader, and from that position, he was able to consolidate power.
He reminded me of Bonaparte, a man who came from outside and was suddenly the emperor himself. but I understand these terms are very critical. I won't use them loosely. Although, again and again, Professor, the 2,500 years in between, we go through this play all the time, and it causes great disorder and chaos and death, and then we go through it again. It's like Syracuse is the original drama, and we keep repeating it. All right, Dionysius the Elder is now the archon of Syracuse. The geography is important. What is the island, and why is that critical to his power?
So the island was the term that the Syracusans used for a peninsula that was originally an island, but it became attached to the mainland by a causeway. So it's a protrusion off of mainland Syracuse that forms a kind of a separate zone, easily defended by means of a wall across the isthmus and supplied with fresh water by means of a natural spring there, which today is still operating, still running, called the Fonte Arethusa, the Fountain of Arethusa, who was a nymph associated with the mythic history of the place. So this island, the island, was so easily defended, and its supply of fresh water meant that it couldn't be starved out in a siege, and so it became a military base, a kind of fortress for Dionysius the Elder, and then later for his son Dionysius the Younger. It was a place from which they really could not be forced out except by extreme measures.
Now, for Dionysius's marrying habits, we get confusing. He married two women on the same day. Was that something normal in Greece in the fourth century?
No, it was not. Polygamy was not a Greek custom. It was associated with the Persian monarchy in the East. And the fact that Dionysius adopted it shows that he was, in fact, taking a lesson from those emperors, the Persian emperors, making himself a kind of royal figure, superhuman figure. Of course, polygamy creates all kinds of problems because when you generate children from two different lines, there's a rivalry and sometimes even civil war between the branches. And that is, in fact, what happened in Syracuse.
Yes, two wives, each produced two sons. We watch all four sons, but most importantly, the son that will rise to power comes from the wife that is not connected to the hero, goat, victim, protagonist, Dion. Let's do this if I remember. We have Doris of Locri, one wife, and Aristomache,
Mhm.
uh, the other wife.
Right.
Which one is Dion's sister?
Aristomache,
Right.
the native Syracusan wife.
And Dion is the brother-in-law. So this is a family affair created by this double marriage on one day. Now, we leave this with the fact that the way Dionysius the First, the elder, conducted his office, he did a great deal of drinking. Was that normal?
It seems to have been normal in Syracuse and, of course, other parts of Greece. But Syracusans in particular were known for their riotous high living, excuse me, including lots of wine. And the ruling family, the Dionysii, were notorious alcoholics.
Yes, they liked their wine. Fine. And there is such a thing as a Syracusan table. Was that a metaphor at the time, or is it invented because of the wine drinking?
Syracusan tables is a phrase that was popular at the time. It's found in Plato's Republic as a description of this high life, the banqueting tables, especially those of the ruler, that supplied lots of feasts, including plenty of wine, and also sexual excess, because whenever there's wine and feasting, there's usually also a lot of carrying on.
Yes, a lot of carrying on. I noticed that there are legends about how Dionysius the Elder died. Did he just die? Did he drink himself to death? Was he poisoned? Is there one version, or do we entertain all of them?
There are several versions. As often in the case of the deaths of great rulers, no one wants to attribute it to simple disease or old age. There's always a conspiracy theory. In this case, the conspiracy did involve poison, perhaps administered by his doctors to prevent any change in the succession. The plan for the succession was to hand down power to the son of Doris, whose name was also Dionysius. But Dion, from the other line, was perhaps trying to get that changed, trying to get power to descend to his own relatives. And the doctors may have administered poison in order to prevent that from happening.
Plato, born approximately 428 BCE, died 347. He is a player in this after spending a life in pursuit of education. He was also in a war, the Corinthian War. But it's important to establish that his roots include a relative, a cousin named Critias, who was one of the 30 tyrants. Who were they, and how did they inform Plato?
The 30 tyrants came to power in Athens in the wake of the city's defeat in the Peloponnesian War. And the Spartans, who were the victors, basically engineered their appointment. They were Athenian themselves, but backed by Spartan power and sympathetic to Spartan interests. There were 30 men. They were supposed to appoint a much broader oligarchy, but instead held on to power and used it to eliminate their opponents, often executing or banishing democratic insurgents and conducting basically a reign of terror for the better part of a year before they were overthrown by a resurgent democracy.
And one of their victims was Socrates. How did that happen?
Well, not quite their victim, but a victim of the restored democracy because of Socrates' associations with Critias. That played a large part in the verdict against him and his execution by the state. He was a teacher of Critias and an associate of Critias, and so was held to blame in part for the period of the 30 tyrants.
Socrates is the major character in Plato's works. He is the speaker of what we call the Socratic method. It was a dialogue presentation, not quite fiction, not quite nonfiction, philosophy. So we come to Plato. He studied widely, he read widely. He wrote poetry, I read, as a young man. But then he became charmed by philosophy. What did that mean to him, philosophy?
Plato's philosophy is almost a quasi-religious system of belief in which there's no learning, there's no possibility of gaining knowledge from the world around us, the sensory world, but rather we have to make a mental leap into an unseen world, a world of eternal and perfect realities or essences that Plato called forms. The task of the philosopher is to train the mind over the course of decades to get past visible or sensory reality and to perceive this alternate world, the world of the forms.
The world of the forms. Plato travels, however, Magara, that he traveled, Magara, and Tarentum. I was taken by Tarentum, especially Archytas, the Pythagorean who rules in Archytas,
In Tarentum.
in Tarentum.
Yes. So the Pythagoreans, we know them as well, their name has become associated with the famous theorem for determining the length of the long side of a right triangle. But in fact, they were interested much more widely in mathematics and number as a way to understand the universe. The universe could be translated more or less into mathematical terms. And that deeply appealed to Plato because math, of course, is an abstract field of thought. If one considers circles and squares, those are perfect essences. They have mathematical properties that are always consistent and eternal. And so they're an access point to the world of the forms.
So here we are, intellectual Plato. How does he get caught up in Syracuse? When does he meet somebody from Syracuse? Why did he become interested in Syracuse?
So we have some information that he was invited there by Dion, the ruler's brother-in-law, because Dion had read some of Plato's works and saw him as a intellectual ally, especially a lifestyle ally, because Dion was estranged from the Syracusan tables, the riotous living of the court. He was a more abstemious sort of man. Plato also, no doubt, saw Syracuse as a kind of a laboratory for political innovation because the ruler there, Dionysius the Elder, was experimenting with new forms of autocratic power. The polygamy that we talked about earlier is one example. So by going to Syracuse, he was essentially exploring the possibilities for autocratic power in a political landscape, the Greek landscape, which he saw as deeply in need of new forms of rule.
So his first visit is 385. What does he learn?
So we don't have a lot of information about that visit. We do have several anecdotal accounts of his conversation with Dionysius, in which essentially he was dismissed with dishonor from the court because he tried to make a case for moral and ethical behavior, and the ruler wasn't hearing any of that. So, this early exchange, which we know very little about compared with the later exchanges with the son, Dionysius the Younger, was a colossal failure, and Plato made very little headway and was essentially tossed out on his ear.
The setting is Syracuse. The first visit by Plato to Dionysius the Elder and the Syracusan tables, Plato has the same reaction the Puritans had towards Charles I, and that didn't end happily. In this instance, however, Plato leaves, and Dionysius the Elder, the tyro, the man who rose up and became master of his world, dies in 367. And Plato is invited back because the throne, well, the metaphor of leader, is inherited by Dionysius the Younger, who is the son of the other wife from the marriage, not Dion's sister.
Mm-hmm.
Dion, about 10 years older than Dionysius II, but he's had great responsibilities and become very wealthy. It's his idea to invite Plato. And James, what a great idea, because otherwise we wouldn't have all this drama. But what did Dion make of Plato? What did he hope Plato would achieve by inviting him?
That's a complicated question because we don't know for sure what Dion's motives were. He may have been seeking power for himself because a lot of people at court realized he was a far better at governance than his brother-in-law Dionysius the Younger. But ostensibly, his goal was to get the ruler educated, since he lacked the kind of education that would make him a enlightened monarch, which is what Dion wanted him to be. So he made the case that Plato, by coming to Syracuse, becoming his tutor, could transform him into a king, a legitimate ruler, rather than a tyrant.
And what did Plato have to offer? I think he started the Republic at this point. I'm not sure. He's been 20 years at the Academy, become extremely famous. He's the philosopher celebrity of the Hellenistic world. So at this point, what did he have to contribute to Dionysius? Don't drink so much, or was he ready to instruct him about the forms of government?
Well, both. And his arrival in Syracuse all by itself was a huge boon to the regime because, as you say, he was extremely well known and respected. So, merely by coming there to attend on the ruler, he was giving him a huge boost. But his lessons started with reform of lifestyle. Stop drinking so much, stop giving your attention to feasting and cultivating flatterers and toadies, but look for real friends, people who are devoted to the same ideals as you for help in governing your realm. Secondly, um, try to focus on these eternals, these forms, and not on the world around you. Try to think in abstract terms, as a philosopher would do.
Dionysius the Younger. It's easy to dismiss him right away as a punk. However, this man has gifts, and one of them is he's a survivor. He's drinking very heavily. The Syracusan tables, the image I get from your presentation, James, is they were all immature and having a good time, kind of like wild teenagers. Is that approximately what we should imagine?
I think that's about right. Aristotle, in one of his lost works, of which we have a fragment, says that there was a 90-day drinking party in the court when the doors were closed and no official business was allowed to enter. So that suggests that there was a kind of a wilding aspect to this group. And they had enormous wealth too from the tax base and the empire, so they could afford to subsidize these bacchanals.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I missed that detail. This is a very powerful state by now. They had a huge fleet, right, and a big army. And were they conquering all of Sicily, or did the Carthaginians still have a foothold?
The Carthaginians still very much in possession of the western part of the island. Syracuse had consolidated the eastern part under its own sway, and also most of the foot of the Italian boot. So they'd extended their power across the Straits of Messina to southern Italy and incorporated a lot of the cities there, including Locri, the home of Dionysius's mother.
Yes, and now we have what the professor introduces as an expansionist power that threatens anybody nearby. And they're looking to chew their way up the Italian boot if they can go forward. And suddenly the leader is very immature, drunk most of the time, a danger to all the teenage girls in the town and more. And at the same time, he has an older cousin, brother, uncle. He has an older uncle,
Mhm.
Dion, who's quite capable of leading this empire, expansionist empire. And Dion knows it, and Syracuse knows it, and I think Dionysius II knew it. Is that correct? He knew that he was challenged by his brother, by his uncle.
I think that's right. He was very much put in the shade by Dion, and especially by Dion's relationship to Plato, which was a much closer bond than the one that he was attempting to forge.
And so the clash is coming. It was over a letter. How did the falling out, given the atmosphere, I can understand anything could have triggered it, but what was the driver?
Dion sent a letter to the Carthaginian diplomats who were in the region to negotiate an end to their fighting with Syracuse. And he said essentially, don't talk to Dionysius without me being present. It's an understandable sentiment because Dionysius was young and untried at this point and liable to make mistakes in a high stakes negotiation. But it could also be interpreted as a betrayal, collusion with Syracuse's great enemy. And that's how Dionysius chose to regard it.
Dion is about to get banished, and he's lucky he wasn't killed. That was not was that the first impulse to banish, to exile rather than kill? I've never understood how they came to that decision.
So one has to see this in the context of, as you said earlier, of an unhappy family. In addition to being a rival and potential enemy, Dion was also the brother-in-law
Right.
of Dionysius. He'd married Dionysius's sister. So it's hard to kill someone who's so closely related to your own family.
In other words, not only is he the brother of the other wife, he's married the sister of the tyrant.
That's right. He's a double brother-in-law to both generations.
I got lost the first time I read that. Second time too, I had to make a chart. You and James provides illustrations so you can sort of follow, but really that double marriage made everything much more difficult.
Yes, it did.
Plato is not happy with what he sees, but he doesn't get to leave right away. Dion is sent away, and Plato, is his fate in doubt? Does Plato think he'll be killed?
Not at this point, but he is very much under a cloud of suspicion. And a rumor, in fact, is going around Syracuse that he has been killed
Hmm.
because, wild rumors tend to get spawned in this kind of environment. Um, Dionysius was determined to have the public see Plato as one of his allies and kept him more or less as a hostage under a kind of house arrest to prevent any sense that Plato has was leaving in disgust at the exile of Dion.
Remember, this is Plato the philosopher. This is not Plato the diplomat.
Right.
So I imagine him in his rooms taking notes or at least observing the facts of what happens when you deal with a tyrant who is uneducable, or at least we can presume he's uneducable. Dion is sent away. Plato is eventually bailed out by Archytas. I like Archytas. Am I coming across somebody who is favored everywhere, or is this just a good view of him?
No, Archytas is considered one of the Greek world's great exemplars. He was both a skilled political leader and military leader, and published philosophic treatises on optics, harmonics, higher mathematics. So he really did give a kind of credence to the idea of a philosopher king.
His his reputation is not adequate for the 21st century. We could use him. And
We,
number 729, I'll never be the same to me again. What did it mean to Archytas?
so 729 is a very powerful number. It's a perfect cube, um, and it's the first perfect cube after 64. So it has a lot of mathematical properties, and the Pythagoreans, who, as I mentioned before, they saw the whole universe in mathematical terms. And if you divide 729 in half, it comes out to 364 and a half, which is very, very close to 365, the number of days in the solar year. And the Pythagoreans just sort of fudged that extra half day so that the number of days plus nights, that is double the solar year, would come out to 729.
You note that we sort of fudge that extra half day too. We call it leap year. So we haven't improved in 2,500 years. Dion is in exile, but he lives very well. He's rich. He travels around. And in his travels, I take it he's talking to people about, we got to do something about Syracuse. It's in the hands of a bunch of characters who are dangerous to all of us. Plato meets him at the Olympic Games. Is that when they next have a conversation?
That's right.
And what does Plato learn that Dion's up to?
So during the 5 years that Dion has been in exile, the tyrant, Dionysius, has confiscated his entire estate and is more or less holding his family hostage. And when Dion learns of this from Plato at the Olympic Games, he determines he cannot put up with this any longer. He's got to invade Sicily and overthrow the regime.
And therein lies the plot. Plato is observing all this. Does he approve of it?
Not according to his own testimony in the seventh letter, and we can talk later about what that letter represents. But Plato describes this conversation and says that he refused to take any part in a coup attempt and condemned it as an evil and offered to mediate between these two warring halves of the family and try to get them back together again.
Now, these family, I said before, it's very complicated how they were all related. But Dion, does he know that his wife is no longer his wife, that he's been deprived of his, what's back? What did Dionysus do to Dion's family?
So to excise Dion from the family, he broke up the marriage to his sister and married the sister off to a regime loyalist, someone whose fidelity he could count on. And also, as I mentioned, stripped Dion of the income from his property and even sold off the property so as to essentially make Dion an outcast and presumably prevent him from ever coming back to Syracuse.
Now, Plato, having said that I'm not going to get involved in war, decides to make one more voyage to Syracuse. What a character he is. Okay, so what does he hope to achieve by going back? I know he's going to plead Dion's case, but what does he hope to see?
Well, his principal motive was, as you say, to try to get Dion reinstated because Dion himself argued that Plato could do more good for him by going to the tyrant's court and appearing in person and making the case. But beyond that, he seems not to have given up until the very last minute on the project of enlightening the ruler and making him into a legitimate monarch, a constitutional monarch. He went the third time with some hope that that was still possible.
Now it's 361. Plato knows that there's a plot back in Athens or in the whole of the Hellenistic world because Dion is hiring Spartans, he's hiring troops, or at least he's talking to lots of people who are alienated from Syracuse. He knows that. Does he convey that to Dionysus? You know, you need to do something here. Things are going to go badly for you. Or does he pretend that he doesn't know and he makes the pitch entirely in terms of family affair?
So it's not clear what Plato knew at the time of his third visit. It's possible he was not yet aware of any plans on Dion's part to overthrow the tyranny. He later writes a letter after his return to Athens in which he does hint very darkly at the coming of this invasion and even gloats a little bit that Dionysius had imagined something that was now about to come true. That is, his worst fears were about to be realized.
The philosopher king is a term that they didn't use in Greece. I learned from James. In fact, it was invented at the end of the 18th century. I'm going to assume that it was James Madison. Just make that assumption. But in any event, what did Plato make of what was going on? Did it inform the Republic or did he regard it as outside his interests?
I think it very much informed the Republic. And in fact, Plato left us evidence of that in that he has Socrates, who's the principal speaker in the Republic, say at one point, the way to learn about tyranny is to listen to a man who's lived under the roof of a tyrant. That seems to be an unmistakable reference to Plato's own experience. So the Republic presents a very harsh attack on tyranny and what Plato calls the tyrannical man, the man who wants to be a tyrant, and instead exalts this figure of the philosopher king, the person we call a philosopher king. And to make that distinction so sharply and to condemn the tyrant as a source of terrible evil, I think it comes directly out of the Syracuse experience.
We don't know if Plato knew that there was a building tragedy. We don't have any idea. The city of Syracuse right now at the moment of 361 as Plato departs is 200,000 people, maybe more, has a wall entirely built around it. It's extremely secure, has a very large fleet, has a very large army, is rich, is chopping its way up the boot. Did I leave anything out? It's a powerful state.
Indeed.
And it's known throughout all of Italy as a state that could threaten us.
That's right.
How far afield were they threatened? Were they threatened in Athens?
Well, we have a speech by an Athenian orator already in 388, so some 25 years before the time that you're describing, in which the orator Lysias, an Athenian, but from a expat family that had left Syracuse, describes the tyrant of Syracuse as a threat to all of Greece, equal in power to the king of Persia. So yes, there were people in Greece who regarded this as a threat to freedom. However, Athens at this time had a very shifting foreign policy and was actually allied with Dionysius so as to protect its own interests in Greece.
Dionysius II is about 10 years younger and a complete tyrant, as we believe it here in the 21st century. The word tyrant had some meaning of different texture in the 4th century BCE when we're watching. Plato is also watching. Plato's made 3 visits to Syracuse, this powerful state, like visiting Moscow or Washington as a philosopher. And the 3rd visit, he was there to plead the case of Dion, who he may or may not know is raising an army. Well, the army gets raised. There's an invasion fleet. They're closing on the island. Maybe Dionysius is ready, maybe he's not. The winds make it not immediately charging affair, but they eventually get there and land. Dion is now the leader of a liberation force. And the question is, what does he plan to do? Because he's been a student of Plato, he converses with Plato. Plato's back in his academy in Athens, where he'll spend the rest of his life, I believe. But the events of Syracuse now have a logic of themselves if you've read Shakespeare. We're in that part where the knives come out. Professor, this is a wonderful story, except for at this point, I got lost in the blood and confusion. What it does remind me of, James, is every revolution I've been through recently. I'm thinking of Bonaparte's, yes, of course, but the Paris Commune, for example, with the Prussians outside bombarding as inside they keep changing leadership and people in charge and people not. Or the Russian Revolution, how the first wave of success is followed by a second wave of defeat, and then here comes this character Lenin from out of nowhere. So it's as if we've been replaying this drama for 2,500 years. Does it strike you as a classicist that we're all building our lives on the infrastructure that you've created in Greece?
In some ways, yes, the parallels are quite striking to the episodes that you've mentioned. I think human nature has certain constant features over time, and one of them is that when a people that's been oppressed by a autocracy are suddenly liberated, that all kinds of passions come to the surface, and the public can become very impatient for sudden and radical change. And that, of course, leads to factional splits and often to chaos, as was true in Syracuse.
Yes, now Dion has reason to believe that he's going to be welcomed, and he is, by the Syracusans because they've been oppressed by this reckless person, Dionysius II. However, I pause here because Dion has learning. He's a mature person at the same time. He knows everybody. He has allies, and one of those allies is the fleet commander Heraclitus,
Hmm.
Heraclides or Heraclitus, which is it?
Heraclides.
Heraclides, who is, at first when you introduced him to me, I thought, well, we've got a Marcus Agrippa. That was Octavian's greatest tool to win to become Augustus was Marcus Agrippa, his fleet commander.
Mhm.
Except for Dion, has he deceived us all the time? He's the secret tyrant. Did he deceive Plato because he acts so badly?
Well, I don't know how badly he acts. He certainly tries to act well and to form a pluralistic government in which he is not the sole authority, and to give the people some, but not all, of what they want for their new regime. The problem is that, as I mentioned, the passions that were unleashed by the revolution were white hot. And Heraclides, as a radical Democrat, radical populist, was able to channel those passions and build support for himself.
He
And
was a Trotsky figure. It's what he became.
that's a good analogy. Yes, indeed.
Um, and he was very effective, and he would have been a great commander. Now, 400 years later, 500 years later, the first century AD, a man named Plutarch, educated, grows up under Nero. That didn't teach him much, and probably a little Claudius when he was a baby. But then Nero dies, the year of four emperors, and here comes Domitian and Vespasian and Titus, the Flavians. So Plutarch is learning what can go wrong with an empire. Augustus is having his achievements abused by his successors, by the Julian Claudian reign, first century AD, and then by the Flavian. However, eventually we'll get a good king out of it, a good emperor out of this Hadrian. But Plutarch has motives. And you made me very suspicious of Plutarch. Plutarch writes a book that we know as Lives. And Dion is in one of his lives. And just
Mhm.
like Plato, Plutarch wants to like Dion. Why? And what did they find in there that makes Dion the hero?
Well, we have to understand that Plutarch was educated as a Platonist. He
Uh,
was trained by the inheritors of Plato's Academy some 4.5 centuries after that institution was founded, and was a great admirer of Plato and wrote dialogues himself in the Platonic manner. So his attitude towards Dion is deeply colored by his respect for Plato, his desire to see the best in Plato's protege and the person that really represented Platonic values in his political career.
So they thought Dion was a Democrat? What did they? How did they regard him? I'm talking about first century AD and
Mhm.
end of the second century. I'm not talking about us, because
Right.
Plutarch becomes an echo of Plato, actually bigger than an echo. He gives us a melodrama.
Mhm. Yes, he portrays Dion in glowing terms as the philosopher king that might have been. And we can talk about what happened to prevent that. But
Well, he had Heraclides assassinated. That's when he lost my attention.
yes, so he committed a political murder to eliminate his rival, and that caused even Plutarch grave difficulties. Plato, interestingly, omits the episode from all of his accounts of what happened in Syracuse because it was a huge embarrassment to the academy.
The Academy is involved in this. Wasn't Callippus a student of the Academy? I think so.
Indeed, although Plato does his best to obscure that fact, but Dion's assassin was another student of Plato.
What is this? Oxford going over to the Germans? What is Plato protecting? Is the Academy have a rival out there? He looks like he's always buffing up the Academy uh, uh, worth, the worth of his Academy. And Plutarch, does he do the same thing? In other words, are they protecting the Academy more than Dion?
Both at the same time, because Dion was, of course, a standard bearer for the academy. So to burnish the reputation of Dion is also to protect the reputation of the academy. And yes, there were rival schools. A man named Isocrates, who deeply disliked Plato's approach, was making his own outreach to the regime in Syracuse as well as to other autocracies around the Greek world.
Dion is successful to a point, and he becomes the dictator of Syracuse after hemming and hawing and much drama. But his success leads to assassination. And how did that happen? What kind of ruler was he compared to Dionysius II, who escapes,
Hmm.
is in the citadel? Why did the not nobodies, but why did the crowd rise up and assassinate Dion?
Well, it wasn't the crowd so much as a faction of his own army. Apparently, after he committed this murder, the killing of his rival, he went into a kind of depression and ceased to care. He apparently even offered that anyone who wanted could slit his throat. So he had some kind of spiritual crisis that made him ineffective. And one of his subalterns, his generals, just split off a section of the army that was disaffected and had them commit the killing of Dion.
It reminds me very much of the assassination of the Tsar's family. It was done very badly. They didn't think it through. They had to make a man on the street, give them a weapon to kill him. My goodness. There were Nero. Remember how Nero couldn't get himself killed, so he kept asking people. Finally, his servant helped him. That's what this reminded me of. All right, Dion's dead. And there's a new dictator, a series of new dictators in Syracuse. And Syracuse has burned severally times. It's getting reduced all the time. People fleeing the city. There's food insecurity. Everything's going wrong in this most powerful of city states, which doesn't displease people. And remember now, Dionysius II is still on the scene. He hasn't left. He's going to assert himself one more time. Remember the teenager who drank too much and caused his uncle, brother-in-law, much distress that led to the invasion fleet that is now pulled apart Syracuse? It's no longer the most powerful state, which must have made them smile in Rome and Carthage and Athens. Must have. I get suspicious sometimes. However, Dionysius II is still on the scene or has returned from the mainland. And he's in the island. Is that correct, Professor? He and his men are secure in the island.
That's right.
Until from Corinth, which is the mother city of Syracuse several hundred years before, a man named Timoleon. Who is he?
Timoleon was a mature man, a man in his 50s, who had lived a private life in Corinth for decades after a political episode that had badly tarnished him and forced him out of politics. But when the call came from Syracuse, to help us here, we need some kind of leadership. Timoleon was appointed to lead a hired army to try to take control of the situation.
And Corinth wanted this to happen?
Well, they wanted to make some kind of effort. Syracuse, as you said earlier, it was originally their colony. So, as the mother city, they felt an obligation to at least try to get things back on track. And Timoleon was their token effort to do that.
I got the impression from the way you tell the story, he wasn't well financed and he just had a bunch of volunteers all in it for the plunder. Is that the way to think of it?
Well, I don't know if plunder was their chief motive, but certainly they were hired, they were being paid a salary. And yes, it was a very meager effort, seemingly just to sort of check the box. You know, we've done our duty as Mother City, we've tried to help Syracuse out.
I'm thinking of the Castro brothers landing on the shores of Cuba, just a fishing boat. And all of a sudden there's a revolution because everybody joins with Timoleon for some reason that has to do with the desperation of the town. And now we've come to the big drama. Timoleon versus Dionysius the Junior, the younger man, with his guard. And yet they weaken and he doesn't fight. Why? Why doesn't he? What is he thinking?
It's a great mystery. He had offered before in the days of Dion's invasion to abdicate if he had control of a fertile province that would give him a secure income for life and a pleasant retirement. And I think he made a deal with Timoleon for essentially that same outcome in Corinth, that he would be able to retire, he'd get a secure home in Corinth, and live out his life peacefully.
He left the city voluntarily in a ship that sailed away. Now, here's the twist. He doesn't die. He lives on in Corinth. He becomes a music teacher at some point so he can boss around children, we're told, and might have become a priest at the end of his life. In other words, he's not punished. That's the surprise to me, Professor. It's totally unbelievable if you're Shakespeare. But if you're writing history, he's not punished whatsoever. And does he speak of what he's lost? You know, the great, rich, powerful man come to this looking for coins because he teaches. Does he talk about it?
Yes. And he's questioned by Corinthians as to what happened and why didn't you learn anything from Plato? How did you come to this pass? To which he replied memorably, "You think I didn't learn anything from Plato? Well, the fact that I'm enduring this exile and impoverishment shows that I did."
And I have a new saying to say, every once in a while when something goes wrong. Dionysius is in Corinth. What did that mean to the Greeks?
So that was an expression coined at the time and went on as a proverb for centuries. Dionysius is in Corinth. Anything could happen. The most powerful ruler could be brought to the lowliest position in society. You can't count on anything.
Yes, it's a wonderful. I wonder, does it have any weight today, or is it completely in the hands of Eugenius classicists, or does anybody use it anywhere?
I haven't heard it used. No, I think it's pretty much extinct.
Well, I'm going to revive it because it's fabulous. We can think of a few oligarch-like characters that when they meet their maker, we could say Dionysius is in Corinth. Tens of thousands have had their lives cut short or are driven into despair by the drama of the Dionysian clan, which is now irony, represented by Dionysius wandering around Corinth looking for work. However, we turn to the Republic. Plato spends the rest of his life in Athens, and he dies around 347 is the number I have, that mid-century. He lives a full life. What's that, almost 80, maybe 80 years old, near 80 years old. He leaves behind manuscripts that we have and enormously preserved, given all that was lost at the burning of the Alexandria Library, thanks to Caesar. We didn't lose Plato because he was so popular. I guess he was copied everywhere. However, we have the Republic to work on because so much of the teaching that I had in the 20th century was informed by the Republic, and I always puzzled about why it seemed to be kind of despotic. Well, it's informed by the events that we just went through as best we could. James, the Republic has an understanding of governance. There are degrees of governance: aristocracy, timocracy, which means landowners, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. Plato, when he wrote all this down and explicated it for the students in Socrates' voice, was that the first time it had been organized, or did he have rivals preaching these same matters?
There were several intellectuals in Athens who were also dealing with political philosophy in this era. It was widely recognized that Athenian democracy was not working out well, and other states were also experiencing decline. So there was a widespread effort to get governance onto some kind of new track.
And the forms of government he was entertaining, he had firsthand experience of the worst of it, tyranny. He found nothing redeeming in tyranny. Where was kingship in the opinion of educated Athenians and Corinthians?
So the distinction between king and tyrant is varies from one writer to another. They define them in different ways. But for Plato, a king was a ruler whose mind had been improved by philosophy and who could govern according to principles of justice and virtue rather than someone driven by appetite, which is how he defines the tyrant.
And the philosophy that informs the king is based upon Plato's understanding of the world around him and then the forms. Is it necessary for a king, the good leader, to know about the forms? Or is that something that only comes to philosophers?
So Plato's thesis in the Republic is that philosophers would make the best kings
Yeah.
because they could they could perceive the form of justice, justice in its absolute essence, and govern according to that principle. The subtitle of Republic is On Justice because the central concern of the work is what is justice and does it make one sublimely happy? And of course, Socrates' answer is yes, it does. And it also provides the best kind of leadership because looking at justice in its earthly forms, precedents and court cases and such, won't teach you anything about what justice really is. One has to get outside of this world and regard justice in its pure form.
Yes, the real justice. Now we get metaphysical. Well, that's probably an inappropriate word here. I don't know. Spooky. All right. Justice is not real as we understand it. What we think of justice is a reflection on the wall of a cave, and we're all chained there looking up at these shadows, thinking that's real. It's not. It's a reflection of the real. The philosopher, if I understand, manages to succeed by getting outside of that cave and sees justice and beauty for what they really are, which is being reflected on the cave walls, but the real thing itself, the form of the real thing itself is perfect.
Mhm.
Philosopher's duty is to go back in the cave. Is that correct, Professor? Go back and teach people who are chained?
Not teach them, but lead them. That's correct. The philosopher has to go back to the cave after getting outside into a world that's lit by the sun, that is the world of the forms, and experiencing sublime joy there. He has to turn back to the darkness, not to teach, but to lead the society.
And that is the image that Plato gives us in the Republic. There's one more part of the Republic. I mean, we understand these forms of government which he's recommending. That's known as the allegory of the cave. Now we come to the myth of which I love, but I don't think I can do it easily. Has to do with a man dying, but his corpse not decomposing while he's on the battlefield. And he wakes up and then he tells a story. What is the story, Professor?
So the final phase of the Republic, final segment, is this fabulous account of what happens after death, told by someone who, as you say, had died but then revived and was sent as a messenger to describe his experience in the other world, in the afterlife. And it's a fabulous account. It's a soaring image of the beauty and order of the universe. The soul travels through this astral realm for 1,000 years until it's ready to be reincarnated into a new life.
And the reincarnation will have temptations. One of those temptations is a river. And you're very thirsty wandering in this 1,000-year landscape. It's the way I read it. I mean, everybody reads it their own way. I'm getting thirsty reading this. And here comes a river. And those who drink deeply, what happens to them?
So the river is called Amylase, which roughly translates to heedlessness. And if you drink to excess from the river, it wipes out any memory you have of this fabulously beautiful universe through which your soul has traveled. And so when you're reincarnated, you can't recover any of those images. If you drink moderately, which is what the souls are told they must do, it's possible to retain some subconscious memory and recover it later. And that's exactly what the philosopher must do, recover the experience he had before birth.
And Plato thinks he's recovered it.
Well, he never tells us his own experience, but that's what he urges others to do by way of a philosophic education in the abstractions of the mind.
Does he think Archytas has recovered it? Because Archytas helped him in his life.
Again, he never says that in his own words, but I would presume that he thinks that Archytas is a model of the recovery of uh, the world before birth.
Now we come to the part that reminds me of Harry Potter when you get to choose what college you're going to, okay? You get a choice as you come to be reincarnated, how you want to come back. I puzzled about this for a while and I decided I wanted to be a Cocker Spaniel or a Springer Spaniel, either one. Did you ever have a choice, James?
Um, Not that I can recollect, but according to Plato, I have. I've chosen many times over the course of millennia, and uh, my choice was always informed by what I had learned in the previous life. So a philosopher who's learned much would be able to make the best choice when his turn comes.
But you can come back as an animal, a creature.
Plato never talks about that. That's, of course, a concept in Hinduism, but I don't think Plato saw that as a possibility. He thought of the choice of lives as being different types of earthly human existence.
Didn't Odysseus choose? I don't remember.
Yes, in the myth of Odysseus, who's given the last choice. So there's a sequence of choosing based on a lottery, and the presumption is that once life is chosen, it's no longer available to the next person. So there's a lot of luck involved. But Odysseus gets the last choice. He chooses the life of an ordinary man who has no particular ambitions, doesn't seek wealth or power. And he says, well, that's what I would have chosen if I'd chosen first. It's a
Wonderful.
charming notion.
Wonderful. And Plato leaves us with the understanding that the philosophers have a memory of that 1,000 years. Is that correct? And they saw the forms and they have a memory of the forms.
Some subconscious memory which can be recovered by the work of philosophy.
There are 13 letters, all of which are said to be Plato's letters, intact, outside of the Republic, outside of Statesman, outside of all the other works. The seventh letter has a lot of detail in it that we've been going in ways following the Dionysian clan. But there are letters that are said to be more or less likely. What's your opinion in general, Professor? Are there traps in here? Or I note that these letters have been argued about for more than 2 millennium, and there seems to be proponents of letters from both sides.
Yes, it's a very controversial topic in scholarship. Um, I only offered my opinion on five of the letters, the ones that deal most centrally with the Syracuse episode, and I accept those five as genuine. There is at least one in the batch of 13, which is a forgery, which is not by Plato. So, of course, that raises red flags that perhaps there are other fakes in there. Um, and the tests that we use for authenticity are not they're not scientific. There can be no scientific proof of authenticity. It's ultimately a question of the weight of evidence. So I go into this in the book. It involves a lot of different kinds of argument, but ultimately I believe that these five are the work of Plato.
The opinions of the letters vary as well. Karl Popper, that's the one you feature in your telling. He has a very, very low opinion of Plato because of these letters. Why?
Not just because of the letters, but because of the Republic. Popper wrote a brilliant book in right around the time of the Second World War called The Open Society and Its Enemies, in which he argued that Plato was one of the foremost enemies of the Open Society. And in fact, the Republic is an argument for his own attempt at autocracy, that he wanted to make himself absolute ruler in Athens. So it's a very negative view, which I don't endorse, but I discuss in the book.
In the book that followed The Republic, was it The Statesman? Was that the last book, The Statesman?
The Laws is his last political work and his last dialogue.
Where is it that he advances himself as a philosopher king? Or does that ever never happen?
Well, The Laws has a speaker who is not Socrates, but is simply called the Athenian. And it's an older man, probably around Plato's age at the time he wrote it. And it's quite plausible. In fact, I believe myself that it's simply a mask for Plato.
So what Plato does at the end of his life, and I'm not accusing, I'm just trying to see the evolution here, is that sentence where what we need is a king who is a philosopher and a philosopher is a king. Plato thinks that he combines these two skill sets. He could be a king or a leader, and he could be a philosopher at the same time. And he becomes the model. Does that work that way in history? Does for 2,500 years, have we come to the opinion that if only Plato was in charge?
Well, Plato never says explicitly that a philosopher like himself should be king. What he says in the Laws is very interesting because it reflects back on the Syracuse episode. He says, give me a city ruled by a tyrant. That's the place where the most reform could take place. And a tyrant needs a wise lawgiver to advise him. And they would make the dream team that would transform society for the better. And so I think he probably saw himself as the wise lawgiver who could be the teacher of the tyrant, exactly as he tried to do in Syracuse.
I'm not going to sound fair-minded here because I puzzle. Plato had facts that mitigated that opinion, and he didn't use them. Is that a way to read the letters?
He seems to have been extremely naive about practical politics. He ignored the obstacles and the pitfalls in Syracuse, much to his woe.
He used metaphor. I'm looking at the seventh letter. One of the joys of the professor's book is that it's endless amount of research you can do afterwards. There's no stopping, especially today when you can just pull it up on a screen. But I have the book here. These things Dion was now doing, writes Plato in the seventh letter, having preferred the suffering of impious deeds above the doing of them, yet being very careful not to suffer them. Nevertheless, he stumbled, having come to the peak of his overcoming of his enemies, suffering nothing amazing. Nevertheless, he stumbled. That's a very inadequate metaphor for what happened, Professor.
Yes, Plato whitewashes Dion's time as ruler of Syracuse so as to make him an innocent victim of the machinations of evil enemies.
He goes on in the letters are so studied that each paragraph is numbered with a letter, 351A, C, 351D. He goes on to say, the same thing also brought down Dion, for it hardly escaped his notice that the ones who brought him down were evil, but the height of unlearnedness to which they had attained and of the rest of depravity and gluttony did escape his notice? Really? Now, what does that teach us, Professor?
Plato was spinning the events in which he'd taken part, just as any political figure or public figure does nowadays. The seventh letter was meant to be circulated widely. It was addressed
Right.
to a faction in Syracuse, but it's clearly written for wide circulation, and it's meant to reestablish his sterling reputation and remove the stain of the Syracuse episode.
And Plutarch followed that same. I don't have the Plutarchian metaphors for this, but Plutarch was equally defensive. Is that correct?
Plutarch subscribed to the view that Plato put forward in the letters that Dion was a virtuous ruler who was brought down by pure evil.
James Romm is the professor of Plato and the Tyrant, the fall of Greece's greatest dynasty, and the making of a philosophic masterpiece, providing us plenty of time to look behind the curtain and see what's really going on in the Republic. This is CBS Eye on the World. Thank you, Professor. I'm John Batchelor.